doing this, Keith.
Oh, you're welcome.
I suppose, kind of start, just how did you hear about Robert and Thomas's music, and what was your first introduction to
My introduction was, I was a Mute fan very early on, because bizarrely, when I was about 12, where I lived, they were building this Barrett housing estate. And for anyone that's old enough to remember, there was the famous Barrett helicopter. So when they came to open the estate, the Barrett helicopter flew in, and they had a local radio DJ from Radio 4th in Edinburgh, who I guess was a semi-celebrity in Edinburgh. He was doing the opening, and he was giving away little bags of records to all the kids. And the bag I ended up with had Silicon Teens in it. So that was my entry point to Mute Records. And I was just getting into music, but there was something about that really grabbed my attention, and so I was lucky that I got into that kind of thing very early on. And I think not long after that, maybe when I was 14, 15 probably, I'd worked out that Daniel Miller was the normal, and I came across the single-sided album Robert Rental and the Normal live at West Runton Pavilion. And actually, for some reason initially, I assumed that Robert Rental and the Normal was the same person. I thought that it was just Daniel Miller with two aliases. Bought that, was obsessed with that, and then shortly after that, a very good friend of mine, for my birthday, gave me a second-hand copy of The Bridge, Robert Rental and Thomas Leer, and that's when it clicked that, oh, actually, Robert Rental is a distinct person. And then from there, it was difficult to find out information about records, so I was a Mute fan, but I didn't know everything Mute had released. Discovered Mute had released Double Hearts, and I mean, for me, that's my kind of, everything Robert Rental did was great, but Double Heart, I was transfixed. I must have listened to that record thousands and thousands and thousands of times. So that was my entry to how I discovered Robert and Thomas. So Thomas as well, I think maybe I'd heard his name previously to getting The Bridge because he'd done this solo stuff, and then obviously then Act came a little bit later, and he had quite a lot of media coverage. But yeah.
You've been DJ for
30 years. 30 years I've been DJing, yeah.
Thousands and thousands of records.
Yeah.
What is it about their music that still kind of stands out for you?
I mean, for me, it just transcends time. I mean, even like Robert's first single, which is his DIY and lo-fi, there's just something so unique and so much imagination and passion. And he just completely had his own thing going on. I'm not going to say like old music is better than modern music, or what do the kids do these days? But I think one thing with a lot of modern music is it uses a lot of the same production techniques. So a lot of it has the same sheen about it, perhaps. Whereas the music back then, all the records had very original individual production. But there was just something, especially about Robert's music, about his songwriting. For me, it's soul music. Most people would hear it go, that's not their definition of soul. There's something just very deep and soulful that kind of just speaks out to me in his songs.
Would you say that their music has had an influence on your own work as a DJ and music maker?
I mean, I think everything you ever hear influences you slightly. I don't know if anything I've made musically has taken influence, but definitely inspired is where we're. And I mean, obviously, it's not really the kind of music I would play in a dance set in a club, but I always try and find ways to turn people onto it. So, for example, when we did Optimo as a weekly club, the first hour of the night was always about playing music that was not up for the dance floor, and we would frequently play both Robert and Thomas's music. Again, any opportunity I can when I do a radio show, or if I get asked about what my favourite Scottish music, I always champion these because I want to turn more people on, and a lot of people have subsequently got in touch and said that they've listened to these records and completely fallen in love with them as a result of me turning them on to them.
Yeah, just because The Bridge is a key part of what we're looking at. Any particular things that stand out for you about The Bridge that is quite unique?
I really love the way that they kind of split it into two. So you have the more electronic, propulsive, rhythmic music on it, and then you have this ambient. Also, the idea that they just kind of had this equipment, had a very short time to do this, and it could have been something that was a little throwaway, but they managed to make this record that totally stands up. I mean, how many years later is it? 40 years? 37 years later. I mean, it still sounds fantastic. Again, it's another record that I know people are hearing now for the very first time, and they seem really, really drawn to it. I have friends in their early 20s, and they hear this music, and it just, something about it reaches out to them. There's a certain naivety and charm to it as well. I think that, you know, there's something deeply uncynical about the music they were making. They were literally at the forefront and avant-garde of whatever it was they were doing at that time.
Yeah, I suppose just sort of bringing it more up to date. What do you see as the kind of legacy of their music in the current climate?
I mean, in the current climate, I think for a long time it was a very cult thing, and you would meet very few people that really knew these records. And I think in the current climate, it just seems to, I mean, exploded is an exaggeration. It's not like your average man on the street knows who these people are, but it seems to have a much, much bigger audience than it used to, which is obviously partly or mainly down to people discovering music through the internet. But I just think there's something about music from that era that speaks to people in this era. Perhaps we're in a similar, it's pretty depressing times in a lot of ways. They were quite depressing times. And I think, you know, they weren't saying anything about the times, but just sonically, it kind of fits with the moods of now. And I think it's fantastic how there's so many young people really interested in that music from the past, and there's people that are out there that are making it available again and doing things like you making this film, and yeah, it's a really interesting time.
Is that DIY ethic still, you know, still to the forefront today?
I think that DIY ethic is very strong, particularly in a city like Glasgow, which is a really strong DIY ethic of lots of people doing fanzines, labels, small little studios, collaborations, but on a very like DIY level where it's never really about making the money. And I think this era is the internet's allowed that again to become something that was perhaps forgotten and lost for a while to come to the forefront again.
Yeah,
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, something I said to Tom yesterday, that, you know, quite often that, you know, Tom and Bob appear as a footnote in these stories, you know, and really we haven't had a chance to tell their story really. So, you know, and Scottish electronic music isn't the biggest thing in the world really.
I mean, Scotland has, you know, a great musical legacy, but in electronic music, and you know, it's a great post-punk legacy. We have a fantastic amount of bands, people using electronics, not so much. There's handfuls. So, for me, Tom and Bob are the icons of Scottish DIY electronic music. You know, they should be a lot better known, which is why, for me, I'm an evangelist to let people know about these great guys that came out of this little town in Scotland and created all this amazing music.